I'm radio and television host Jimmy Church, and I'm here to uncover the truth about some of life's biggest mysteries. If this is revealed, everything has to be rewritten. My guest today is Timothy Hogan, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and an expert on the esoteric history of humankind.
It was probably broadcasting this energy all around the planet.
Technical assistant Josh. Josh, can you pull up the map?
Yeah.
Also joins us to help set the scenes. Join us as we deep dive to get to the bottom of some of the most intriguing questions of our time. Have you seen the Ark of the Covenant? Welcome to Into the Vortex. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, and today we're going to jump into one of the most controversial subjects for this community, which is the Knights Templar. And our guest today is Timothy Hogan, Grand Master of the Knights Templar. And being able to go directly to the source for this information, it's not only important for the community, but it's very important to me. And I'm pretty excited about this. Josh, you ready to get this going?
Oh, I'm excited. I'm fascinated with the Knights Templar, and I'm excited to continue my education. You're the right man for the job.
Great.
Well, welcome, Timothy. And we need to really just jump straight into this. And the most important question to start this off is, what is the true origins of the Knights Templar?
Well, you know, most historians will say the Knights Templar were founded in 1118. Actually, the order was started as early as 1096. And it took a while before they got involved in Jerusalem. And, you know, they were doing stuff prior to the Roman Catholic patronage, which, you know, existed for a while until it was removed in 1307.
Well, we have the historical side that we're all taught and the dogma that has been established since then, that they were there to escort the Crusades and to defend the Crusades and have a military presence there in Jerusalem. But then we have the other story, which is they were digging, they were searching, they were looking for artifacts and text, and some things may have been spirited out of Jerusalem. How can we address that from a historical perspective? Were they searching for things?
They were definitely searching for things, and not only that, but there was a belief, a definite belief that there was a primordial tradition that had existed prior to a deluge, you know, which we would refer to as Atlantis. And that when it collapsed, there were pockets that had spread out to different parts in the world. So they were trying to seek out these different pockets to obtain what these pockets were preserving, and then also to dig in areas that they absolutely knew there were things to be found.
Let me stop you right there, if I may.
Yeah.
You used the A word. Mm-hmm. You just said Atlantis, and most haven't connected the Templars with Atlantis. And when you say something like that, what are you actually trying to say? I
mean, they started out looking at, you know, the Torah and the Old Testament and the stories of Noah. I mean, here's this story of there was this cataclysm that occurred where there was this massive flood. And they had connections with groups in the Middle East, particularly groups like the Druze and the Sabaeans and others, who were preserving and translating texts that alluded to these earlier civilizations, and including Greek and Roman texts. So they had exposure to the works of Plato and others, which talked about this pre-civilization. So they wanted to find out, okay, where's the technology from this pre-civilization? Where's the philosophy from this pre-civilization? You know, what was their religious beliefs? What has been preserved from it so that they could bring it back into Europe and get Europe out of the Dark Ages?
Did they understand what they were discovering, and how did they translate that knowledge into something that not only that could be applied to their mission and what they were doing, but how do you understand a high technology culture, from Atlantis to their period.
There were allusions to technology within the Bible itself, and that's what they were primarily looking at the time. There weren't a whole lot of books around, and so there were allusions, particularly within the Torah, talking about the Ark of the Covenant, which was this device that could do all these crazy things, and if people touched it, they would be electrocuted to death, basically. And they were working with people like Rashi of Troyes in France, who was a good friend of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote the Rule for the Templars. And they were passing on a knowledge and a history of, hey, here, there are these artifacts and they are buried at certain areas, and this is where you can find them. So go down and get them.
What did they find?
So in their archaeological digging, they found a number of things. They did find a series of boxes or arks, which had also been incorporated on the Egyptian temple walls. They've discovered substances of, strange, mysterious substances is how they described it, that which we would call manna.
Manna from heaven?
Like manna from heaven, yeah.
Right.
But it was a substance that they learned that they could manufacture alchemically. They also they discovered these lost arts and sciences. They also discovered tombs of a number of holy people that they discovered their bones, and they collected them and brought them back. And some of this was a real problem because it was contrary to the narrative that the church was perpetuating at the time, but it was completely in line with their own beliefs. They tended to be more of a Gnostic persuasion, which was they believed that anybody through their own efforts could attain a direct knowledge of the divine. They didn't need a priest to do it. So
let me jump in right there, Josh. Pull up the cartouche, because people ask about evidence. Okay, these are extraordinary claims,
Sure.
but how can you back this up?
Yep.
And I want you to look at this. This is from Egypt, and I call this a cartouche, but this appears to be a cartouche with an ark represented there. Is this what I'm looking at?
yeah, that's right. It's an ark box, and it's levitating off the ground, it should be pointed out. And that cartouche thing that you're talking about is actually a field. It's like an electric field that's around it, that's attached to it's like a rope that the pharaoh on the left is holding to control it. This is an example of one of these boxes, and you can find them all over the place. This particular one was at Edfu, where there's the Edfu building texts that also talk about
Probably the most historic, important text on planet Earth, right there in Edfu.
for sure.
Here, the reason why I bring up the cartouche symbology is the Egyptians, when they represented something inside of this shape, the cartouche shape, it suggests nobility. It's related to the pharaoh. It's extremely important.
Yeah.
And so to have something like an ark represented here, it's huge to them.
Yeah, it is my understanding, it's my belief, and certainly the belief of others, that what they were talking, they discovered these boxes were basically like capacitors. They could build up large amounts of electricity that would discharge, and if you didn't handle them properly, they could shock you to death.
Do you think this is the Ark of the Covenant?
Well, according to our Templar tradition, there were actually multiple arks that were discovered.
Josh.
Yes.
This next image that Josh has, I think is extraordinary, because this, I think, represents exactly what you're talking about.
Yep.
Because here, it looks like we've got 4.
Yeah, and this is at Dendera. There's four arcs there, and you can see they're issuing forth the electricity out of the tops of them. there were multiple arks, I think, that were being used around Egypt. Certainly one of them ended up becoming the ark within the Hebrew tradition. Some have even speculated that maybe the reason why the Pharaoh was even chasing Moses was because he had stolen one of these arks out of Egypt. And that's what he was really trying to get. So it's a, but we find them on the temple walls all over the place. And usually associated with this ark, you also find these depictions of these conical white cakes or these mounds of what would be manna, described as manna in the Bible.
I'm going to swing back to that.
Yeah.
Is it possible that these arks, or one of them, made it out of Egypt and Jerusalem and back into Europe by the Knights Templar?
Yeah, according to our records, we actually recovered 6 arks that we brought back into Europe through Portugal, through Lebanon. There's a site called the Tomb of Hiram, which you can find in Lebanon, and it's actually not a tomb at all. It was just a vault where these things were held. It was there for a while before it would move to Portugal, and then from there up to Scotland, and then from Scotland, they were brought over here to the New World.
To the United States. So there's a possibility.
Was to become the United States, yeah.
Josh, if we found an Ark of the Covenant here in the United States, what would you say?
My mind would be blown, and I wouldn't be able to stop talking about it for a long time. The fact that there's 4 arks is the first time I've ever heard that, and the fact that it could be around the world is super compelling and fascinating to me.
Well, this would truly rewrite history.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's, I want your reaction to this too as well. Here, you brought up manna. Mm-hmm. So here is a manna jar.
Yeah.
And now when we see something like this, again, I always go back to the evidence and the science that supports some of these discussions.
Yeah.
And what is going on here?
What we have here at the bottom of this jar is this white powder that's manna. It's the traditional manna. And you can see it kind of, when it forms, it forms as like this conical shape, this mound at the bottom of the jar. And this substance, beyond being something that's healing, it's also superconductive. So you can imagine, if you consider the stories of the Ark was actually created to hold the manna. And then Solomon's temple was created to hold the Ark. So the entire purpose for Solomon's temple was to hold this manna. You know, the manna went in the Ark went in the temple. And this manna, being a superconductive substance, when it was put inside the Ark, and the Ark was basically like a capacitor.
An energy source.
An energy source. It just issued a tremendous amount of electricity. And this is the reason why nobody could touch it without dying.
And this is a manufacturing process, and this is how this was done.
And this is it, yeah.
Okay, so again, it's back to the evidence into deep history. Yeah. And when we mention the manufacturing of this, of the manna in the jar, there's a cone shape at the bottom, but I think it's represented. Josh, if you could,
yes,
pull up this image here. Is that what we're seeing here, Tim?
Yes, that's exactly what you're seeing. So as you see, the figure who represents Osiris is holding this cone-shaped bread, and he's handing it to the guy that has the heaven plumes of Amen on his head, and he's offering it to him. And the reason why it's that cone-shaped is because that's how it forms when you go to make it.
And there's a lot of excitement in that image too as well.
He's very excited.
What is inside of the Ark? You mentioned that possibly the manna manufacturing process is happening there, but it's like the biggest mystery in history. What is inside of the Ark?
Well, traditionally they said that the tablets, the what we would now know as the tablets of the commandments, were put inside the Ark, as well as a pot of manna is how it's described. It should be pointed out that Moses had both the Ten Commandments and then he also had these tablets of testimony. And according to alchemical traditions, this tablet of testimony was actually this emerald tablet. But these things were put inside of the ark. From a power standpoint, that manna is really a superconductive substance. So when you put a superconductive substance inside a capacitor, like the ark, it just causes it to produce an immense amount of electricity that it just broadcasts out.
I've got a couple of other images here that to me represent a vessel. I see a vessel here, and we just looked at a manna jar, and I see the connection. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, so what we have here, so this is at Amiens Cathedral. So one of the things that the Templars did when they came back to Europe is they were responsible for building the first cathedrals of France. And inside these cathedrals, they put all kinds of imagery. Most people think of just biblical scenes, but they also depicted alchemical processes for manufacturing this manna. And this is one example of that. You see the figure holding, it's called an Athanor oven. It's an alchemical oven, and they're pulling a salamander out of the bottom of it. And what they're really depicting is, in the language, the alchemical language, a salamander, they didn't actually believe that lizards lived in ovens. But they knew that, like, you could break down the word salamander into the words sal and mandra, which meant sal meant salt and mandra meant stable. So what they were saying is you could extract the stable salts out of the oven after you've calcinated down all the other materials. And so this is what they're trying to depict.
In this next image, where apparently we're seeing the exact same thing.
Yep.
And if somebody's walking past this cathedral and they see this, they would not make these connections, but the symbolism is right there.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. This is another one. This is at Amboise, but it's. Yeah, they're depicting the exact same thing, and these secret salts, these stable salts that they are extracting out, is the manna. This is the manna that they have to calcinate down the vegetable matter. In fact, for that matter, this is the whole reason why Moses witnessed God as a burning bush, because you have to calcinate down the material. And then you can extract the manna out of it. And this is what's being depicted.
So if I'm understanding correctly, so let's back up. We have this representation now in Europe that was brought to Europe, the alchemical traditions from Jerusalem by the Knights Templar.
Correct.
Who discovered this in Jerusalem. And this is evidence of these alchemical and high-tech traditions that go back to Atlantis.
Correct, yeah. And that they were also being preserved in Egypt after the collapse of Atlantis. You know, the story is that Egypt was one of the centers of preservation.
Well, okay, so you brought up Edfu.
Yeah.
So in the Edfu text, and that history certainly points back to the origins coming from Atlantis. The same catastrophe is represented there in Edfu.
Yes.
And that is a direct Atlantean connection, which again goes back to Jerusalem, to the Knights Templar, back to Europe, and possibly to the United States.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly how it goes. So,
is there stuff here in the United States?
There is. There are vaults here in the United States that had been brought over as early as the 1200s, is when the Templars, they would leave their port in La Rochelle in France and in Portugal, and they would bring this stuff, over here to the new land. They had the entire North America mapped by the 1350s, but they had been coming over here since the 1200s.
And why North America? To keep things safe, I would think?
Yeah, they were trying to create a new Jerusalem. They recognized that Europe was completely controlled and dominated by between the Roman Church and the monarchies. They were controlling everything, and people had no freedoms, no freedom of thought, no freedom of religion, no freedom of assembly. All the things that we take for granted now as Americans, they didn't have those things. So they came to the New World, they established connections with the natives here, and they brought these artifacts over, and then they set up a new system so that these things could be preserved.
Will this eventually be revealed?
Yes.
And the reason why I ask that is history, the way that it exists today, nobody wants to change that. And the reveal of the Knights Templar, understanding, occupying, mapping, and spiriting artifacts and important relics into the United States and stashing them in these vaults. If this is revealed, everything has to be rewritten.
That's true. Yeah, but it's the history. I mean, there were things, and especially I know you've talked with Scott Walter before, but his work with the Kensington runestone, that runestone was a land claim for North America that was created, and it was placed right in the center of North America because they had already mapped the entire continent. And the connection with the natives that were here, there are still certain tribes that continue to preserve and protect these vaults here in the United States.
Now, you're the Grand Master of the Knights Templar.
Yes.
That's a pretty important position, right? The traditions today inside of the Knights Templar, are they the same traditions from the 1300s?
They are. We don't pay any allegiance to the Roman Church anymore. We started out independent of the Roman Church. We had a brief period of time of patronage with the Roman Church, and then the Roman Church, along with the King of France, suppressed the Templar Order in 1307, and that didn't go too well for 7 years. There was a lot of torture and burning at the stake. So
Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th. That was the origin of that. At the core of what we are, we've always been dedicated to preserving this tradition, and we've had to adapt to the cultures and the habits of the different countries that we've lived, and the religious philosophies of the different countries that we have done work in. But ultimately, yeah, it's the same work. And ultimately, we're also committed to this idea that everybody has a spark of the divine in them. Everybody. And through their own efforts, they can attain a direct knowledge of the divine, and they don't need a priest to do it.
These vaults that you referred to earlier, do you know where they are?
Yes.
Would you tell me now?
I can't tell you right now.
The importance of that, because when somebody hears that, they go, okay, well, this would change things. Why not speak about this now, and let's take a film crew in and see what's going on?
I think we're building up to that. We had to make people aware of some of the origins of some of this stuff first. And one of the biggest challenges we're going to face once we do reveal it is, you're going to have a number of different countries that are going to try to claim these things for themselves. And we got to get to the point where we're past all that. I mean, these relics, these treasures are a gift to all humanity. They belong to all of humanity. They don't belong to any one particular power structure. Even though we're protecting them, we didn't even feel like they belong to us. We're just kind of preserving them for the future. So
you could tell Josh, he won't tell me. And he can keep the secrets. But here's the thing. Are these relics that would not only change history, but change the way that the Bible has been represented to us, and Jesus and God and Mary and Joseph? Is this something that could potentially just tip things over?
Completely, yeah. I think a lot of things will have to be rewritten or understood in new light. It's not that what the Bible says is wrong per se. It's just that how it's being interpreted now is different than how it actually is. And so it's going to force people to have to look at these things a little bit differently. And that's a real threat to certain church power structures at the time, currently.
Let's back up if we can. Did the Knights Templar at that time understand, in 1300 in Jerusalem, when you're discovering these things, possibly that they are important. You may not know what they represent, certainly when it comes to the alchemical traditions.
Yeah.
But do you think that they understood enough that it had to be kept secret and that later another generation would understand the importance of this?
I think so. As evidence of the fact that, when the order was suppressed, it was pretty brutal. And there was a reason for that, and it was because the church and the monarchy at the time, they both had a vested interest in keeping things the way they were. And all of this threatened that. And it still does to a certain degree. We're talking about technologies, first of all, that are pre-cataclysm technologies that have been preserved. Well, that you have to have people accepting that, okay, there may have been a previous advanced civilization to begin with. So that's the first thing. The second thing you're talking about is personal salvation through your own efforts that has nothing to do with the power structure getting you into heaven. So that's a change of thoughts for people. Another thing, too, that was right along with this is Templars have always sought to preserve the rights of individuals to have the freedom to explore these things. In fact, one of the earliest medieval texts was a book called Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach, which is one of the first Grail stories, and it was written in the 1200s. In it, it says that Templars are in charge of guarding the Grail. And it also says, when the Grail appears in the text, it says, if any Templar should become a ruler of a foreign people, let him ensure that they are given their God-given rights. Well, this is the first time in history it's ever suggested that people have God-given rights, and that, because prior to this, people thought your rights came from the church or from the king. And this is saying, no, your church comes from a divinity that transcends all that. And, this is something we still stand for. And, if you're a power structure trying to control people, that's a problem.
Before you move on, quickly, I need an example of a pre-cataclysmic technology. That was a fascinating line.
Yeah, so, these Arks were pre-cataclysmic technologies. Ultimately, I think their purpose is to broadcast electricity, much like the works of Nikola Tesla when he created his Wardenclyffe Tower, where to broadcast electricity around the planet. This is what these Arks do. They broadcast electromagnetic lines of force around the planet to these sacred areas. And, that's a problem too if you're trying to put a meter on having people pay for electricity. So
when we talk about the Ark and what may be inside of it, it's the dimensions of the Ark too that I'm very curious about. And I think there was some pretty successful research into it may fit exactly into the box, some call it a sarcophagus, the box inside of the King's Chamber, inside of the Great Pyramid. Coincidence?
I think that is absolutely 100% right on. The Great Pyramid itself generates static electricity. If you were to stand on top of the Great Pyramid with a glass bottle with a wet rag on it and hold it up, sparks would start shooting off of the bottle from just from the natural conductivity of how the electricity builds up from the desert. So if you then stuck an ark in the center of it, in that King's Chamber, with a superconductive substance in it, it's just going to broadcast a tremendous amount of electricity within the area. And I think that's exactly what they were doing.
With all of this energy, the depictions of what is created with the Ark of the Covenant, you have to wear body armor to carry it. You can't look at it directly. Your life is going to change if you do. With the concentration of this kind of energy inside of the Great Pyramid, It could have done a multitude of things. It wasn't just one specific thing, was it?
No, I think it was used for a lot of different things, but it was definitely broadcasting electricity out, and I think this electricity was being harnessed at the different temples in the region. In fact, if you look at most of these temples, they have stones with what are known as butterfly clips around the periphery of them. And these butterfly clips, we know that used to have metal in them. And so they were just basically like receivers for this electricity. So you could just kind of plug your things, whatever you had, into these things to run it. And I think this is one of the secrets of the ancient world that, you know, it probably got established originally by the Atlanteans. At least that's what history suggests, or myth, you could say. And then, you know, as things declined, it just kind of fell apart, and then people started stealing the butterfly clips for the metal or whatever.
And staying on this, because the bronze, the copper, whatever metal they were using to bind these stones together certainly suggest a large megalithic circuit board, if you will. But if you have multiple arks, clearly represented by the Egyptians, were these power sources for these different temple complexes and possibly other pyramids throughout Egypt?
I think so. And if we also consider that the Great Pyramid itself is in the exact center of the land masses of the world,
right,
it was probably broadcasting this energy all around the planet, which is a distinct real possibility. So when these boxes were removed, it's like it shut off the power for the entire planet, which is a real problem, you know? If you're using that for your little power base, your control.
All of that is great. Have you seen the Ark of the Covenant?
Yeah, I've seen one of the Arks. We currently, within the Templars, we have 6 Arks in our possession. We are aware of potentially 4 other ones. That's 10 total. But we're still trying to get to them at this time.
Can you tell us where you saw that ark?
Yeah, I saw it here in the United States.
Really?
Yeah.
Did you wear body armor?
No, because it wasn't activated.
Right. Were you worried about that, though?
Well, so part of what came with the ark was these rods. It is actually referred to as Aaron's rod in the Bible. But what these are is grounding rods. You can take the rod, stick it in the ground, and drop it against the ark, and it'll ground all the electricity into the ground so you can handle it.
We need to circle back, though.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Holy Grail.
Yes.
And the way that Parsifal represented it, I think that it was more of an open book where we can interpret what the Grail actually was. Did the Grail make it to the United States? Did it make it over to the Americas? And what is the Grail?
It did. The Grail has been represented as many things. I mean, it's been popular in recent years to associate it with some sort of bloodline from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And while that may be true, you know, there were other depictions of the Grail as well. I mean, it was described as a stone that can burn the phoenix to ashes, after which it comes back renewed. Well, this was an alchemical metaphor.
That's right.
It was also described as an emerald that fell out of the crown of Lucifer after this war in heaven, and it was brought to earth by these neutral angels. Well, this emerald was really it was a metaphor for what was known as the Emerald Tablet, which is a tablet of alchemical instruction. And even beyond that, what it really is it's a substance that looks like an emerald. It's not even really an emerald. It's if you want to get down to it, it's a copper acetate that is crystallized copper that ends up looking like an emerald. And you can extract from these monoatomic Manna atoms that are extracted alchemically.
Well, back to Josh's question earlier, where this technology is older than we think, and the alchemical traditions go back, if we go back to the A word, right, Atlantis, we're pushing this back 10, 20, 30,000 years.
Yes, yeah. Let me give you an example of how it has shown up in other ancient civilizations, the same technology. So we refer to it as Manna. That's what we encounter in the Torah, or the Old Testament. It's referred to as manna. But we find the same word and the same substance being described in other ancient civilizations. For example, in ancient Sumer, the name of the alchemical science was known as Graal, Graal, Grail. So that was literally the name of the alchemical science. And they used it to create something known as Manna. And Manna was used to help with the flying craft of the gods, the Anunnaki. We find the same word in the Vedic texts as being called Vimana. So we have Manna, Shimana, Vimana, and these Vimanas were also flying crafts of the gods from pre-cataclysmic times. In the Polynesian cultures, we find it being referred to as Manna. Same thing, though. It's this force of nature that they're able to extract. Within the Gnostic traditions, like in the Albigensians of southern France, of which the Templars largely came out of, they used to practice a ceremony known as the Mani Sola ceremony. And it was like a communion rite with this substance that they referred to as mani. Well, this mani is the same thing as the mana, which is the same thing as the shimana and the vimana, and we also find it in a number of other places. So it's all these ancient traditions were preserving the same thing, the same science from ancient times, and it tied in directly to these arks, and this is one of the things that the Knights Templar got a hold of.
How ultimately, Tim, would this change history? And if it did, and it should, for those out there that don't want this history changed, what kind of fight would, there's going to be some oppression, from the other side. How do you move this forward? Again,
Fundamental to this belief structure is that everybody has this source of the divine within them. So there's no one group that are the only chosen ones at the exclusion of everybody else. We're all in this together.
Can the world handle it?
I think so. I think we're getting to the point with our modern technologies, with our internet, in our global community. We now are associating with each other more, recognizing our commonalities. We have to work together now as a world to solve problems and to do things that are for the best for the planet and for ourselves and for the other inhabitants of the planet. And ultimately, I think we have a destiny beyond this planet that we're getting to. And I think all of this ancient technology that we're sitting on and these ancient philosophies are all geared towards helping us go that direction.
Does this conversation today, do I earn a pin?
I will definitely give you a pin after we're done.
Thank you so much. I look forward to everything that is about to be revealed. And these are exciting times, and I think we're ready for it. You ready for it, John?
I'm ready. I'm ready.
This is Into the Vortex. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, Timothy Hogan. Incredible conversation today, and we'll catch you next time.